This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Thank you for tuning into this week's NC Spin. We've got a lot to discuss with you. With 45 days before the elections, the campaigns are turning nasty, and we want to talk about the debates, polls, and the nastiness rearing its ugly head. Governor Cooper announced this week that children in grades K through 5 can go back to class, and we ask how many school systems will reopen. And as always, we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Speaking of the panel, this week we have Howard Lee, former state senator and former chair of the State Board of Education, Anna Beavon Gravely, the executive director of NC Free, Chris Fitzsimon, director of the state's Newsroom, and John Hood, syndicated columnist and author. We'll begin our uninterrupted debates after these brief messages from our underwriters. In more than 21 years on NC Spin, I never endorsed a product or sponsor, but I volunteered to do this message for family physicians. Over the past 40 years, my family doctor could quickly diagnose my illnesses because he knew my medical history. Evidence suggests I'll live longer, have a higher quality of life, and save 33% on health care costs. I believe in my trusted relationship with my family physician.
Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Your life is more flexible and efficient than ever, and your energy is too. See how North Carolina's electric cooperatives are building a brighter future for the rural communities we serve at ncelectriccooperatives.com/brighter.
Let's begin the spin. We suspected this would happen. With fewer than 45 days remaining before the 2020 vote, the elections have turned in more of a food fight than an exchange of ideas and philosophies, and all indicators say it's going to get even worse before November 3rd. This week, viewers in Raleigh-Durham saw the first U.S. Senate debate between Thom Tillis and Cal Cunningham. We want to start the discussion there. I want to ask each of the panelists, in your opinion, who won the Tillis-Cunningham debate, and tell us why. Anna Beavon?
Well, I'd have to say that I think Senator Tillis won the debate hands down. He made Cal Cunningham stick to his talking points and his messaging and play his game.
All right, John Hood.
I think Thom Tillis won the debate as well, primarily because of Cal Cunningham's mistake. He let that vaccine comment that he made sort of dominate the subsequent news coverage, and that was not to his benefit, obviously.
Howard Lee.
I think it was pretty much a tie. I felt like watching that debate, these were two minor league boxing fighters in the ring testing each other out, and neither one landing a punch, but throwing a lot of punches, but not landing.
Interesting. Chris Fitzsimon.
I thought it was either a wash or maybe a slight edge to Tillis. I thought it's significant that Tillis was so much on the attack, which shows that he knows he's behind in every single poll, which he is. The vaccine comment comes actually out after that comment came all the questions about the CDC being politically inspired and all that. So it was the first. They're going to debate some more. And the last point is, I think in our current political climate, nobody's still talking about the debate, which means there wasn't a gaffe big enough on either side that will definitively affect this race.
Yes, and they will meet again, and this was just particularly in the Raleigh-Durham market. Anna Beavon, there are many debates for offices up and down the ballot between now and the elections, and many are saying these made-for-TV events no longer serve the voters because candidates are so rehearsed. They use the time for attacks instead of answering questions and sharing ideas. You work in this political arena. Do you think voters really benefit from political debates?
I think it depends, which is like the ultimate political answer. The higher the office, president, gubernatorial, and U.S. Senate, probably less so, more about who's going to make a mistake. But when you get to more local office, that's where it can make a difference because these candidates have a chance to get in front of a new audience that they might not have gotten in front of if not for the debate.
John, we're looking at presidential polls, and there are very few really undecided voters at the top of the ticket. But as you go down the ballot, how many undecided voters are there?
If you go far enough down the ballot to council of state races, judicial races, absolutely, you've probably got 20%, 25% of the electorate who won't claim a preference one way or the other. Some of them will simply come home to their party. Probably most of them will simply come home to their party. But enough of them will either not vote in one of these down ballot races or split their tickets in ways that will generate some different results. When we're so closely divided that even a few percentage points of true swing vote will still swing the election.
Chris, we got some really good information, deeper information than just who's ahead and who's behind. In one of the polls recently, it demonstrated that Trump was 17 points ahead with men, and Biden is 16 points ahead with women. There's still a lot of questions about Hispanic voters. What do we know about how they're breaking?
Well, I think that's one of the key demographics, obviously, in this election. Vice President Biden, former Vice President Biden, is significantly ahead with Hispanic voters. Nobody's surprised by that. The question is, how many of those can Trump peel away? I do think it's worth noting in the last handful of polls in North Carolina, Biden is ahead by 1, 2, 3 points, but all the polls in North Carolina are within the margin of error, unlike most of the other races. The Cunningham-Tillis race is not. Surely the Cooper-Forrest race is not. The closest race in North Carolina right now is the presidential race.
Howard, the Trump family is all over North Carolina. President is coming to Fayetteville this weekend. Members of the family. Biden hasn't been in North Carolina. There are a lot of people saying there's no way he's going to carry this state if he doesn't at least go to Raleigh and Charlotte and Fayetteville. What do you think?
I think that has merit. I have been hearing lately, however, that they are planning a series of trips into North Carolina. They do have a lot of surrogates here in the state. I understand that they have a fairly sizable staff, and that staff is certainly working to try to both identify and come up with plans to get out the vote. So I think Biden has a presence here. He may not have been here personally, but I'm confident we will see him fairly frequently as we get closer to the election.
Chris, we said this race, these elections are getting pretty nasty. This past week, Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger accused NCAE of being cop killers. And of course, the inference is that NCAE is strongly Democratic. House Speaker Tim Moore accused the Democrats of accepting funding from a group that wants to defund the police. Your reactions to this? And by the way, did you notice it was all Republicans hurling these accusations, not Democrats, back? And why is that?
Well, I mean, I thought this was one of the more despicable displays by Senator Berger in a long time. That the agenda actually doesn't say that they were referring to, doesn't say defund the police, A. Number two, or B, most people that when they say defund the police, they mean reduce the funding, have more social workers on the police and all that. This was clearly an attempt, a desperate attempt to be outrageous and get everybody to talk about it. And what's so interesting is if you're going to do this, President Trump and all the Republicans, for the most part, have endorsed a candidate who's now going to be in Congress in Georgia who believes 9/11 was a hoax and is a QAnon person. I don't see so is it then fair to say every Republican is a QAnon member, supports QAnon? Of course not. So I think this was an insidious escalation into the negative politics that people are so turned off by Senator Berger.
John, we've been talking about the large number of absentee ballots that have been requested, and right now it's, as I understand it, it's close to 800,000 that have been requested. A number of them are coming in. This past week, we learned about a situation in Charlotte in which 5,000 or 6,000 voters actually received 2 ballots. What do you know about this situation, and how serious is it?
Well, we don't at this point know that it's larger than the event as you described it, but that's still a disturbing accident, disturbing error. I don't think it was perfidious. I don't think there was an actual attempt to encourage voters to cast 2 ballots. It would be impossible to register 2 ballots with the same address and name and so forth. But it was a problem, and it does illustrate there are risks. I don't think most of the risks associated with mailing in a ballot have to do with elaborate conspiratorial fraud. It has to do with mistakes, either mistakes by the state or often, as we've seen in other places, mistakes by voters. Who will unintentionally spoil their ballots or fail to complete their ballots. So I'm worried. I think we should all be a little nervous about this experiment.
And the State Board of Elections has said that elections officials are going to be trying to look at these ballots, and some of them that get thrown out because they didn't have a witness signature or whatever. They're going to try to follow back up with them. But Anna Beavon, the State Board of Elections started a new service this past week, for voters to track whether the absentee ballots that they have mailed have in fact been received. And does this mean the ballot is going to be counted if it's been received?
We certainly hope so. I mean, I think that's what they're trying to do, to sort of address some of the concerns that John mentioned just a second ago. We want to have as much confidence in the system that's in place, but also that your vote's going to count. And if they're tracking your vote and they're telling you that your ballot was received, the assumption is that it's going to count.
Yeah. And Howard, early voting starts in about a month, as a matter of fact. October 15th, the early voting starts. We're still hearing stories about precincts and counties that are having difficulties finding poll workers. This past week, the state announced that state employees who have an allocated number of hours per year that they can devote to public service, state employees will be able to work the polls and get paid for it. What do you think of that?
I think that's a wonderful idea. I know one of the reasons we're having difficulty finding enough poll workers is that many of the poll workers are retired and elderly people like me who really don't want to take a chance of being out and exposed to the possibilities of contagiousness. So I think it's a great idea and one that I hope will help us carry forward this election in a reasonable fashion.
North Carolina Court of Appeals issued a ruling this past week that overturned a lower court verdict, saying the legislature did indeed have the authority to put constitutional amendments on the ballot for 2018. Some believe this says that voter ID is legal and can be used in North Carolina. Chris, what's your take on this verdict?
I don't think that that's true. I mean, I think we're going to not, and plus the election is coming up too soon. I wanted to make one thing. I think, Tom, you said 5,000 ballots were sent double. The Mecklenburg County elections say fewer than 500 ballots, absentee ballots, were sent out double ballots. So I just want to make sure people don't think it was in the thousands.
Yeah. Okay. So, John, is voter ID? I know it's not going to be for this election, but did the court say it was legal to have voter ID in North Carolina?
Well, the appeals court went further than that. They said it would be illegal not to have voter ID in North Carolina because it was added to the Constitution as a requirement. Now, that doesn't mean any particular bill that implements voter ID is necessarily legal. As we know, there are other cases that have been filed that have arrested the enforcement of voter ID in North Carolina for this cycle. I think we'll ultimately have voter ID, and I think it will be no big deal. I continue to be frustrated. We've spent a decade debating an issue that really is a minor matter that mostly just provides people who don't have photo IDs for voting and other purposes.
Final question on this topic, Anna Beavon. This is the season also when we start to see endorsements from various groups and organizations. Do they really make much difference in the outcome of the elections?
Again, I hate to give the political answer, but it kind of depends. It depends on the sphere of influence that particular endorser has. If you have a race that's close, or I think specifically you might be referring to Erica Smith endorsing Sonia Nichols in Senate.
Well, NCAE's endorsement, right, and Scenic's endorsements.
Right. I think that they'll definitely carry some weight, but if you've made up your mind, it's not going to matter to you.
Well, 1 month into the new school year, boards across the state are hearing disgruntled parents saying virtual learning isn't working and are urging their school systems to return to the classroom. On Thursday, Howard, Governor Cooper announced that children in grades K through 5 can go back to class. Classes can have the regular number of students. What do you think about this announcement? Is it going to be safe?
Well, I think it can be. Certainly, moving in that direction carries with it a certain amount of risk. And of course, it could start the tick-ups again. But I've been very impressed with the way Governor Cooper and Dr. Cohen have methodically moved forward making these decisions. The important part of this decision, however, is that local school districts can decide what works best for them and go and implement it. But there are two serious problems we need to be cognizant of. One is transporting these kids on a school bus is a high risk, but I hope that the school buses will be sanitized and of course, managed in a way. And the other is, young kids are still prone to touch each other and to engage in ways that many of us find difficult to avoid ourselves. But I think it's the right direction in which to move, and I'm hoping that it'll work out well for everybody concerned, because it is important to have these kids back in school.
Go ahead. Anna Bevan, the governor said this was K through 5. Why not the rest of the schools going up through high school?
Well, I think there's he wants to start slow. That's been the trend that the governor has had through this entire coronavirus process. And starting with the elementary school age children, lets some adults go back to work, businesses start back because they have their employees, but also lets the public school system not be overwhelmed.
One of the big issues involved with this is teachers, John. You come from a family of teachers. Teachers all across the nation are retiring, saying it's not safe to go back to the classroom. What do you think is going to happen in North Carolina? Are teachers going to push back? NCAE has already said they're not sure it's safe to go back.
The NCAE, North Carolina Association of Educators, is the main force that kept a lot of these school districts closed. Whether you like it or not, that is what happened. And I think that some people in the Cooper administration, probably including Secretary Cohen, believed that this was the right policy weeks ago. I think what has happened is the teachers accept that the parents have rebelled. I mean, this ball was rolling. The governor did not push this ball. It was already rolling down the hill. He just didn't want to get run over by it. The parents who have young children at home who can't work, who their children aren't being educated, they were furious. And special education children in particular are being ill-served. So I think the governor did what he had to do. I think that NCAA is unhappy about it, but they're not going to slam him just weeks before the election. They desperately want him to be reelected.
And Chris, John makes a really good point here, so far as whether the governor said this decision was being made using science to make the decision. But we know that, as John said, parents have been screaming at school board meetings. The politicians, Phil Berger and the GOP, has been saying that it's time for the kids to go back to school. Are you convinced this was a political decision or a decision backed by science?
Well, I don't think the NCAA runs everything in North Carolina like a lot of folks. I think it was a combination of what's best for the state, what's best for kids, what NCAE thinks, what teachers think, how schools are equipped. I also think it's worth noting there are studies that show the youngest kids are the least likely to be affected. Once you get up into the middle and high school years, that's where they can become infected more, transmit the virus. There's a lot of, I trust Secretary Cohen, and I actually trust Roy Cooper on this. I'm sure he's taken input from all sides, but to say somehow that everything that Cooper does is the NCAE's decision, I think is wrong.
Well, that really wasn't my question. My question was his decision political or was it science-based?
I'm saying it was a combination of all those things, but I think overwhelmingly the governor's office and the secretary have been following the science.
Howard, we're talking about the subject of teachers. We've already got a teacher shortage in North Carolina. If we see this surge in retirements in our state as a result of this, it could be devastating. I mean, already 17% of our teachers are over the age 55 and come into that category where they are more at risk, and 11.4% are in the 50 to 54 range. You think we're going to see a surge in retirements?
I think as we go along, certainly that possibility exists. I think, however, it will be more enhanced if we find that contaminations and contagiousness increases as these kids return to school. And it doesn't help that we've had a number of cases recently where teachers have gone into the classroom, and some even without students, have ended up contracting the virus and then dying fairly quickly thereafter. So when you hear examples like this, it creates fear within teachers. And I think we're going to have a real challenge to try to convince a lot of these folks to stay with us and to be a part of this experiment.
Well, particularly since the governor said that they can go back with the same number of students as they normally have. They don't have to have desks 5 and 6 feet apart. Anna Bevan, we're going to have to take the temperatures of all of the people who come into the school building every single day. That leads to the question, or begs the question, about nurses. the legislature has not been willing to fund nurses in every school. Do you think they need to do that?
Well, I think that's definitely more of a consideration now because we're dealing with a global pandemic. But when they made the decision, that was not on the radar of anyone. So I think that's something that should be heavily considered and likely done.
Yeah. Chris, in the recent two-day session of the legislature, they allocated $40 million to help improve broadband high-speed internet throughout North Carolina because superintendents estimated that 100,000 or more of our school students don't have access to that at their homes. Now, the money that they have allocated is largely going to be used for about 100,000 hotspots spread throughout the state. But these hotspots have limited range to them, so there's still going to be many kids who aren't going to have internet in their homes. How much help is this really going to be?
Well, I hope it's help. I mean, I applaud them for trying. I don't think it's nearly enough, and a lot of kids won't be able to get to the hot spots. I think they should have done more. I think we should have a long time ago thought of broadband broadband internet like water and electricity. But we have to do something in the short term. I guess this is the thing they thought they could do. I would point out the legislature's been in session many times since the pandemic started in March with school nurses. They could have funded school nurses for this fall, last spring, this summer, this fall, and they chose not to. So the school nurse issue, I think, is really important given all the challenges our schools are going to face, and they simply didn't do it.
We talked, you alluded, John, to some of the challenges that schools are going to have to reopen, like circulating air and other school buses and things of that nature. Not a lot has been said about the economics of our public schools in North Carolina. Most of the funding is done on a per pupil basis. Now, we know that there was a surge in the number of parents who chose homeschooling this year, the number who decided to send their kids to private schools. What are the economics in public schools going to be this year? Are we looking at big deficit for public schools?
I don't think we're looking at big deficits. We are looking at declining shares of North Carolina children in district schools, but that was happening before the pandemic. It probably has been accelerated somewhat, but don't expect it to drop by 5 points or something like that. The trend isn't that large. These are glacial movements, not gigantic movements. But I would say that so far, the state budget picture in North Carolina is not as bad as people once thought.
Or as many states are.
And actually in much of the country, the situation is not as bad as was originally anticipated. And the economy, the latest estimates for the U.S. economy are rosier than before. We're still down, going to be down for the year, but only half as much as was originally thought.
Howard, final question on this subject. Let's just assume, we're playing what if. What if we can get all of our public school, 1.5 million public school kids back in class by the first of next year? How much damage will have been done? How much will they have lost in learning from virtual schools?
Certainly there will be a fair amount of fall off in terms of information retention, and there will be a need to work harder to catch up. But I don't think it's a dire outcome. We can help kids catch up. As long as they're healthy and as long as they're alive, we can find ways to get them moving forward.
You got 2
minutes. We may have to come up with some more creative ways to do it, but we can do it. It won't be a death sentence.
John, we got 2 minutes left in the show. I want to start with everybody and ask you to tell us something we don't know.
Just real quick, sales tax revenue in North Carolina in the first 2 months of this fiscal year up 11% over last year. That's one of the optimistic signs some are pointing to.
All right, Chris, tell us something we don't know.
I mentioned this last week. It's even changed more this week. The death rate per 100,000 from COVID in North Carolina is 30 citizens. That's less than half of South Carolina and Georgia. It's a third of Mississippi. Whatever you think of Governor Cooper, fewer people are dying in North Carolina than every other southern state except Kentucky. Somebody's doing something right.
Howard Lee, tell us something we don't know.
You know, I recognize that as we go through this, a lot of our restaurants, especially family-owned restaurants, will be closing down. I did check with a friend of mine, Chef Jason Smith, who opened 18 Seaboard years ago, and found that his 3 restaurants are doing well. and they look like they will be able to withstand the pressure and survive. And I think that's good news, because we're going to lose some really great restaurants.
And Jason should give you free meals for a year for the free advertising statewide. Now, Beavon, tell us something we don't know.
In a recent poll done on the Holocaust knowledge within the millennial generation, 15% of millennials blame Jews for starting the Holocaust.
Wow.
And 55% could only identify, or only 55 could identify that it was associated with World War II.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm sorry for my generation.
Yeah, well, we're not teaching history. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, sign up for our free weekly email newsletter, give your feedback, and read my weekly column. Be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And while you're on the website, be sure to subscribe to our free weekly newsletter, to our podcast, and to NC Spin on the YouTube channel. Join us next week for more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
In more than 21 years on NC Spin, I never endorsed a product or sponsor, but I volunteered to do this message for family physicians. Over the past 40 years, my family doctor could quickly diagnose my illnesses because he knew my medical history. Evidence suggests I'll live longer, have a higher quality of life, and save 33% on health care costs. I believe in my trusted relationship with my family physician.
Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Your life is more flexible and efficient than ever, and your energy is too. See how North Carolina's electric cooperatives are building a brighter future for the rural communities we serve at ncelectriccooperatives.com/brighter.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.